Hello again, Steve here with a few comments on why it is that I believe the church becomes corrupt. And when I say the church, you might think that I'm just talking from some sort of a Catholic perspective, because that's often how the Catholics feel, right? The only church is the church that the papacy sits on top of. Well, even in the Catholic sense, even in the the more theological sense, the real church exists in our hearts. They say it's something that's within us, and that's the origin, the real sort of the mystical side of the charismatic maybe side of Christianity. It says that Christ dwells in our hearts, and Christ is the so the personification of man, so that we are sort of like the walking embodiments of God. In other words, if Christ is part of us, is part of the soul, and we're carrying that Holy Spirit right around. It's all just ways of painting ourselves into a sort of a non-philosophical, but at least an emotional state, which expresses a grander sense of self, if you will. I guess it's kind of hard to explain it, but one of the questions I have is, why is it that if this has such benefit to humanity, and of course downfalls is too. Some people are going to focus on the downfalls that it has. Why is it that it can be so corrupted? Well, I think it's because, just simple. I mean, humanity is corruptible. We constantly fall short of the target that we're aiming for, right? And whether it's a church as an institution, okay, well, it's going to be corrupted, because if it has lots of power, then people who like power for the sake of power are going to get in there, and it's going to be corrupted. And even within ourselves, it can be corrupted. And that's why each person around the world is going to have a different take on, even if it's the same, even if they're all in the same religion, they're all going to have a different take on it, right? So it's just a reflection of humanity. That's all I would say the church is. I mean, people say that we are created in the image and likeness of God. Well, I would say that also, I mean, I don't know enough about that, but I would say that we also paint our own gods in the image and likeness of us, right? I mean, why is it that there's so many gods then? If and everybody thinks theirs is right. Well, I think there's a lot of painting God in the image and likeness of those who create that in their mind too, right? And I think there's one of the things about religion, and I think it's an evolutionary trait that we've taken on, which is that we have, because we've come out of a tribal state, and we still to a great extent are tribal animals. And a tribe is like a larger sense of self. It's like a large family, right? And if we want to be a part of that, then we have this innate, this very deeply ingrained desire or tendency to want to be part of something that's grander than ourselves. And therefore, if we're not philosophical, we can fall into corruptibility, credulity, gullibility, by those who are very adept at sort of talking to those who are non-philosophical, who are not going to think for themselves. Now, this has pros, I say, and pros and cons, right? Because if you take the example of the Ukrainians who settled the prairies around where I live, many of them were probably not very philosophical. Some of them were Orthodox Christians, some of them were Eastern Catholics. But whatever, it doesn't really matter to that extent. But what they did when they came as a group, several people that got together, is they would build their church, their physical building, their church, their worship area, with steeples sticking up in the air, or spires. They would build them before they would build anything more than a hole in the ground for themselves to sleep. I mean, it was unbelievable. And to this day, you drive around the countryside, and all of a sudden you see a church with looks like big onions sitting up on top of Eastern European churches, sitting way out in the bald-ass prairie somewhere. And you got to go on, why the heck is that even there? And to this day, the community who no longer lives there, but they're still a community because they maintain that church, they still go out and paint it, and they have weddings and whatever there. And it looks like this piece of, it looks like something that belongs in a, in a settler's or a frontier scene of a museum almost, but it's sitting out in the middle of nowhere with just, like grasslands blowing in the distance. And But I think that was a positive thing, because in the absence of philosophy, if there are traditions that help to hold people together as a tribe, which help to check their individual drives, which may be destructive to themselves and the tribe, then that's a positive thing. So they would build their place. So they had that community that they would come together at, and they would talk about things that were not just superficial, but they would talk about deep things, and they would have, probably pancake breakfasts and pierogies and whatever. And they would build a community there. They would continue that tribe, which is a natural state for humanity. Now, the downside, I would say, of this human nature to want to glom on to what's grander than themselves are examples throughout history, examples of guys like Napoleon. I'm recently doing a little bit of information gathering on this character, Napoleon. I mean, the guy was amazing. We can learn a hell of a lot from him in terms of somebody who can get shit done. But what a monster, And millions of people followed this guy. I mean, he brought 600,000 people into the snowstorms. 500,000 of them almost froze to death in Russia. And after that war was over, the British captured him. They put him on an island in exile in the Mediterranean. He rounded up an army there and marched back into France and took over again. People still cheered for him. And he went on to slaughter several 100,000 more of his own people, basically through wars and fighting the British again. And I think that's a downfall that people have. Most people are, it seems like, are kind of subject to the leadership in their area. So that the leadership is beneficial, they will follow in beneficial morals and principles that are kind of imposed upon them by the tribe, that they accept, rather, that they gullibly and credulity, with credulity, they adopt them, and they could be beneficial for them. But if it's a monster, and he's promising them a bunch of free stuff, like, we'll go invade this other country and steal all their stuff and bring it back and give you guys jobs and goodies, then they'll go, yay, let's join that. And it's really important, I think. It's really important for us, because those who aspire to leadership or making a difference in the world have to aspire to leadership. One of the things that we talk about in Toastmasters, and I've talked with different people, in fact I had a great discussion last night with somebody about it, is that they often talk about how, what's the tipping point in a community? Like, how many clubs could be in a community of a certain size? And there is always a saturation point for whatever it is. I mean, even the Amway people don't want to talk about this sometimes, but if you have everybody, like a whole bunch of Amway distributors going after the same people, hey, will you join my business? At a certain point, there's a saturation point, whereas the first guy in to an area, nobody knows about it, and it's all fresh meat in a way, right? Well, it's the same with the Toastmasters clubs, that when there's only one club, it's a big, strong club. But if you have 30 clubs in a small area, they're all kind of struggling. But it's not that, in my opinion, it's not that there's a shortage of potential members. What there is a shortage of potential leadership, right? Because you look at a guy like Napoleon, one guy, he was able to lead millions of people. Millions of people still talk about him to this day. An amazingly charismatic individual, amazing leader. I mean, a very evil leader, very destructive leader, but nevertheless, a leader who people were willing to follow. And in the absence of philosophy, there is an absence of basic logical morality. There's an absence of principles, and a huge amount of credulity, because it's whoever's going to offer me the best deal, I'm going to take. It becomes purely pragmatic, right? It's principleless. So, when we look at the Pareto effect, which is the square root of a group, produces, 80 or 90% of the production. Well, it's the same thing I notice in Toastmasters. In this area, there's probably 250 Toastmasters members of Toastmasters. Now, what's interesting, if you have 10 people in a group, or 9 people in a group, the square root is 3, right? So you'd have to have 3 leaders to produce. And if it's 1, if you're starting an organization like a hot dog stand, well, the square root of 1 is 1. Like, you are the leader, and you have to do everything, including washing the dishes. So, but as you go up from there, the smaller number of leaders is required. Till you get to Napoleon. Napoleon was able to lead millions as himself because the number of leaders shrinks and shrinks and shrinks. The square root in numbers shrinks. So if you get to 100, the square root of 100 is 10. You go to 200 and it's about 14. It doesn't even go up 50%, right? So in this area, about 250, whatever the square root of that is probably 15 or 16 people. And I notice when I go to the conferences, about 15 people in this area who are the movers and shakers. And as long as there's one in the club, if you take them out of the club, it falls apart. Because the vast majority of people are followers. And I think it's because in the tribal setting, right, there's only room for so many people making the decisions. The rest are followers. And you always had your alpha male and the alpha female typically, and the rest fell into line depending on the size. You might have some betas who've got some authority. They're like the vice presidents, put into positions. But there's room for one kahuna at the top, one who howls at the top of the mast. And so and this is what happens. This is why the church is corruptible, I would say, is because you have something that is innately human, which is that we want to be part of a tribe. We want to be part of something grander than ourselves. So if the biggest gig going on in town, or what we see as something that could be helpful for our family, like learning of some spirituality and getting connected with God and so on, and there's a church group down the street, and it's run by some charlatan who's very charismatic, well, it's going to be corrupted because so much is involved in the leadership. So much that takes place is leadership. Because so much production that gets done in there. The only reason why the church is there is because of the charismatic leader. The only reason why there was a French Empire was because of Napoleon and nobody else, right? Sure, he ponied onto the Jacobins to get there, to kill the king off. But after that, he took over, right? And this is why, corruptible, power-hungry people are always going to try to get themselves into any organization, including the church, and corrupt it for their own personal gain, right? And that's why I think if we have spirituality, it has to be inside. Because that way it's not, we don't have to allow any corruptibility because we don't really have a Pareto effect at that point. The square root of one of us, of ourselves, is one. It's us. We have the responsibilities. We can't lay the blame on anybody else. So I would say to people, if you're going to belong to organized religion, make sure that you're running it through that one. Forget about the Pareto effect in there. Run it through. And if it doesn't make any sense, if stuff doesn't make any sense, throw that crap out. Like the guys who came by the house the other day, they had the Bible and they had spelled out in red the only stuff they could read because that was the stuff that their charlatan had told them to read, right? And they didn't want to read the rest because it wasn't filtered through the charlatan yet. So, you be your own editor. You put your own red in there. Thomas Jefferson, he made his own Bible, right? He said, okay, this stuff makes sense to me. This stuff doesn't make sense to me. I'll throw all that stuff out and keep this stuff. That's for us to do. That's for us to do. And all the greats throughout history, the Jesuses and the Buddhas and all that sort of stuff, that's what they did. And people want to catch onto it and say, now we've packaged this all up and this is the truth. Well, if Jesus was to walk in any of these churches, he'd say these guys are bollocks. Think for yourself. Look into your heart. Is it right for you? Because if you're going to be independent and you're going to be somebody who comes up with things that make sense for you, don't just look at the word. Look in your heart as well. And make sure there's a connection there. And if there's not a connection, go with the heart first. Hope this is helpful about why the church can be corrupted. Is because human beings are corruptible for their own personal gain. And without philosophy, really, they're not wrong because they're going for what? A lion doesn't have philosophy, but it's not wrong when it kills a gazelle and bites through its throat. It's doing what it can do to eat for the day. And this is what humanity does when we're non-philosophical. Metaphorically speaking, and very often, actually. Steve here again, great chatting. If this is helpful, please like, subscribe, and share, and comment in the box below. Talk again soon. Bye for now.